General Audience number 72 of February 10th, 1982. From Christ's words about the future resurrection of the body, reported by all three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we have passed in our reflections to what Paul writes about this subject in 1 Corinthians 15. Our analysis focuses above all on what one could call the anthropology of the resurrection, according to St. Paul. The author of the letter contrasts the state of the man of earth, that is, historical man, with the state of the risen man, characterizing in a lapidary and simultaneously penetrating way the inner system of powers specific to each of these states. That this inner system of powers must undergo a radical transformation in the resurrection seems indicated, first of all, by the contrast between the weak body and the body full of power. Paul writes, quote, "What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised glorious. It is sown in weakness, it is raised full of power." 1 Corinthians 15, verses 42 and 43. Weak is thus the body that rises, to use metaphysical language, from the temporal soil of humanity. Paul's metaphor of the seed corresponds also to scientific terminology, which defines the beginning of man as a body by the same term, semen, seed. If to the apostles' eyes the human body that rises from the earthly seed seems weak, this signifies not only that it is perishable, subject to death, and to all that leads to it, but also that it is a natural body. The body full of power, on the other hand, which man will inherit from the last Adam, Christ, inasmuch as he is a sharer in the future resurrection, will be a spiritual body. It will be imperishable, no longer threatened by death. In this way, the antithesis, weak, full of power, refers explicitly not so much to the body considered apart, but to the whole constitution of man considered in his bodiliness. It is only within the framework of such a constitution that the body can become spiritual, and this spiritualization of the body will be the source of its power and imperishability or immortality. This theme has its origins already in the first chapters of Genesis. One can say that St. Paul sees the future resurrection as a certain restitutio in integrum, that is, as the reintegration and at the same time as the attainment of the fullness of humanity. It is not only a restitution, because in this case the resurrection would be in a certain sense a return to the state of the soul shared in before sin, outside the knowledge of good and evil. See Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Yet such a return does not correspond to the inner logic of the whole economy of salvation, to the deepest meaning of the redemption of the mystery of redemption. Restitutio in integrum, linked with the resurrection and the reality of the other world, can only be an introduction to a new fullness. It will be a fullness that presupposes man's whole history, formed by the drama of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. See Genesis chapter 3. And at the same time permeated by the mystery of redemption. According to the words of 1 Corinthians, the man in whom concupiscence prevails over spirituality, that is, the natural body, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 44, is condemned to death. Instead, he should rise as a spiritual body, as the man in whom the spirit will gain a just supremacy over the body, spirituality over sensuality. It is easy to understand that what Paul has in mind here is sensuality as the sum of the factors that constitute the limitation of human spirituality. That is, as a power that binds the spirit, not necessarily in the Platonic sense by hindering its own power of knowing, seeing the truth, and also the power of to will freely and to love in the truth. However, what cannot be at issue here is the fundamental function of the senses that serves to liberate spirituality, namely the simple power of knowing and loving that belongs to the psychosomatic compositum of the human subject. Since the subject of discussion is the resurrection of the body, that is, of man in his authentic bodiliness, spiritual body, should signify precisely the perfect sensitivity of the senses, their perfect harmonization with the activity of the human spirit in truth and in freedom. The natural body, which is the earthly antithesis of the spiritual body, by contrast, indicates sensuality as the force that often undermines man, inasmuch as by living in the knowledge of good and evil, he's often urged or pushed, as it were, toward evil. One cannot forget that what is at issue here is not anthropological dualism, but a basic antimony, antinomy. What is part of it is not only the body, as Aristotelian hyele, but also the soul, or man as a living soul. See Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. Its constituents are, on the one hand, man as a whole, the sum total of his psychosomatic subjectivity, inasmuch as he remains under the influence of the life-giving Spirit of Christ, and on the other hand, the same man, inasmuch as he resists and opposes this Spirit. In the second case, man is a natural body, and his works are works of the flesh. By contrast, if he remains under the influence of the Holy Spirit, man is spiritual and produces the fruit of the Spirit. Galatians chapter 5, verse 22. One can therefore say that we are dealing with the anthropology of the resurrection not only in 1 Corinthians 15, but that St. Paul's entire anthropology and ethics are permeated by the mystery of the resurrection, by which we have definitively received the Holy Spirit. 1 Corinthians 15 constitutes the Pauline interpretation of the other world and of man's state in that world, in which with the resurrection of the body, everyone will share fully in the gift of the life-giving Spirit, that is, in the fruit of Christ's resurrection. To conclude the analysis of the anthropology of the resurrection, we should turn our minds once again to Christ's words about the resurrection and about the other world. Words reported by the evangelists Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We recall that in his answer to the Sadducees, Christ linked faith in the resurrection with the whole revelation of the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses, who is not God of the dead, but of the living. And at the same time rejecting the difficulty raised by his interlocutors, he spoke these significant words, quote, "When they rise from the dead, they will take neither wife nor husband." Mark chapter 12, verse 25. To these words, in their immediate context, we devoted our previous considerations, passing on from there to the analysis of 1 Corinthians 15. These reflections have a fundamental significance for the whole theology of the body, for understanding both marriage and celibacy for the kingdom of heaven. Our next analyses will be devoted to the latter topic.